Hi everyone, my name's Dan Sherrington and I'm the head roaster at Detour Coffee Roasters in Hamilton, Ontario. I've been roasting at Detour for almost 4 years now, and we were asked to put together a little video by Leaderboard to coach on how to kind of differentiate and try to tell the difference between the roasting system that's being used on these coffees. So the first thing I want to say is that there's a couple really amazing videos, super informative, by Lee and Stacy just above that kind of go over a lot of things about heat transfer and different roasting systems. In this video, I'm going to piggyback on a little bit of that stuff because I think a lot of it is super relevant and true, and I'll try and add a couple little things that might help in finding out which roasting system is being used. Now, if you played Leaderboard Seasons 1 and 2, like we did, you'll know that this part is pretty hard. And it's definitely challenging. So what we're talking about is coffees that are roasted on kind of a traditional drum roaster and coffees that are roasted on an air roaster, like a Loring. And basically, I think most manufacturers would say that most of the heat transfer that's happening in the roasting machine is convection. But there's a little bit of a difference with how the heat is applied in a drum roaster versus an air roaster, where there's actually more conduction happening in the drum roaster. And that's from the actual heat source being applied to the spinning drum. And basically what that means is there's a little more direct heat transfer, contact between that bean and the drum that kind of drives the heat transfer through the roasting process, more so than in an air roaster. The environment of an air roaster is still hot, but more of the heat transfer is coming from air, from convection. So what I also want to touch on is a study that Stacy also mentioned, which is where professional roasters got together and they matched roast profiles on different roasting machines. So that would be like an air roaster or a drum roaster. And they kind of sent these coffees out to coffee professionals all over the world and gathered data to see if people could taste the difference. And overwhelmingly, I think the results were that it was very, very difficult to taste the difference. I think each question had 3 options or 3 answers, and probably only 29 to 30% got those right. So you almost have as good of a chance to just kind of guess at each question than tasting. But what they were really diligent with and really kind of skilled roasters, they were able to match those profiles really, really closely. And I think that contributed a lot to why it was so difficult to tell. I think there's another aspect to it where depending on what roaster a company has at their roastery will depend on how they're actually driving that roaster, applying that heat, and that might affect the end product. But I'll talk about that a little bit while I talk about the 2 areas that I think you can look at with these leaderboard coffees to try and decipher what it was roasted on. So the first thing I think that it makes sense to look at and to talk about is taste, because with leaderboard, that's what we're trying to do, kind of train our palates. So first we can talk a little bit about the drum roaster. I would say that you would be looking for slightly more body, heavier texture, and a few more of those kind of like sugar browning, caramelization notes. And there are kind of a lot of different ways that this can come about, but the ones that come to mind are basically thinking about that conduction, that actual direct kind of surface of the bean to the drum roaster energy kind of transfer, or heat transfer, sorry. And also just the fact that with a drum roaster, sometimes depending on your setup and kind of what your batch size is and what your capacity is, and kind of what your overall end goal of the roast is, you might have to push the time of the total roast or even certain phases of that roast a little bit longer to avoid things like roasting defects, like scorching, where you might burn the bean just from the sheer heat of the drum. So basically, yeah, a little more body, some more sugar brownie notes. Maybe that could come from longer time, still yielding, of course, like a really nice light roast and a light coffee, just a little more time in the roaster, and also that direct kind of heat transfer with the drum. Okay, and so for an air roaster in the cup, which is what a lot of people find in the talk in the industry, is basically that you might have a more kind of focused and nuanced cup with a little less texture or body and possibly like a few less of those sugar brownie notes. And that's obviously, again, kind of in relation to lightly roasted coffee on an air roaster. And one of the things that I think about a lot, particularly because we roast on a Loring, is how quickly you can roast a coffee on an air roaster, how quickly you can move through the roast as a whole, but also how quickly you can move through different stages of the roast. Convection, with its kind of efficiency, and also with the roasting setup, you can kind of push through those roasts more quickly. Maybe you can reach a similar color to a drum roaster, but in a quicker time, for example. Not that everyone on air roasters is roasting that way, but it's definitely possible. And what you might find is that there's a little less of those kind of sugar development notes, and also a little less perceived body. So the next thing would be taking what you've gained from cupping those coffees or brewing those coffees and tasting them, and kind of actually physically looking at your at the coffee itself, at the beans. What I find is that, especially like thinking about taste and how it relates to the visual coffee, is let's say you have a coffee on the table or a coffee that you've brewed, and it's quite light, quite delicate, maybe floral, has some really focused notes, high acidity. And then if you looked at that bag of coffee and the beans are really light, maybe pretty mottled, dry looking, not super puffed out, you might be able to say a good educated guess was that this was roasted on an air roaster. And then for a drum roaster, you want to think a little bit more about that kind of drum contact. So you might be tasting a coffee that is still quite light, vibrant, juicy, nice acidity, maybe a bit rounder, a bit more perceived sweetness or body. And then if you look at those beans and they're maybe slightly more colored, and I say slightly because all of these coffees are going to be quite light, but maybe a slightly darker or slightly more colored bean, maybe a little puffier, a little less mottling or wrinkling, and you might be able to say, I think this was roasted on a drum roaster because of those reasons. Now, the biggest thing to note is that this is certainly not a perfect science. It's definitely quite difficult to tell, I would say, and professionals will tell you we would all have trouble, I think, kind of in a triangulation or a blind cupping, picking out the different roaster every single time. But it's definitely good to be thinking about kind of what you're tasting, who roasted it, what they're roasting on, and then maybe as kind of like an aside, what is their roasting style? So something I've been thinking about with air roasters a lot recently is that some of my favorite roasters, who happen to be Nordic roasters from Scandinavia, you see there's a trend moving towards air roasters. I think because the thought is that you can roast kind of a developed coffee to maybe a slightly lighter color, maybe a little more quickly. And that seems to be kind of growing in popularity there. So I hope these little tips helped you out with this part. Again, taste, take time, learn, be patient, make educated guesses, and then go back to your notes when they reveal the results for season 3 and try and think about what you wrote down and then what the actual kind of roasting machine was, and go from there. So thanks so much. This was really fun. Thank you to Leaderboard for asking us to make a video. And yeah, everyone, really hoping that you enjoy season 3, and good luck.